Hey everybody. So today I'm sharing the last excerpt from Chapter 2 of A Christian Case Against Donald Trump. And that book is available on Amazon at the link below. Now Chapter 2 is called The Way of Peace versus the Way of the Demagogue. And this last section was the hardest one for me to write. It's about Trump's demagoguery around the abortion issue. And those of you who've been watching me for a while on this channel know that I was personally very active in the pro-life movement for years before I went into pastoral ministry. And so you know that I've had to wrestle through this issue for a long time. So I hope you listen to this talk with an open mind. I'm making this video for people who sincerely struggle with this issue. If you're sincerely trying to figure out where you stand, then this section that I'm going to read from the book is for you. But I just have to address those of you who come on here every day and call me things like a baby killer or a murderer. I've been called that hundreds of times, probably thousands by now, mostly by people who support Donald Trump, but not exclusively. Just recently, a commenter on here told me I'm personally responsible for the death of a young woman in Georgia because of my basic pro-life background. So it does happen both ways, but mostly from people who support Donald Trump. And I think it's a really sad thing about our politics lately, that we're forced into opposing camps where no matter what we do, no matter how we add things up, somebody's going to call us names like that. I think, so for the people who come on here and call me things like that because I oppose Donald Trump, I'm just going to say as calmly as I can that you need to grow up. I'm certain that I've invested hundreds more hours than you ever will actively working to uphold the sanctity of life in America. And your support for Donald Trump has put the most hateful face imaginable on the pro-life movement in America. And you have set the movement back at least a generation. So congratulations. I'm sure you feel very virtuous about that. But for the people who sincerely want to hear what I have to say, here's my section on abortion from the book. It's the hardest section that I had to write, and I hope you find it helpful in some way. Trump's demagoguery on abortion, a case study. Just to level set, let's begin with a basic fact that's gone underreported. Donald Trump is running in 2024 as the most pro-choice Republican presidential candidate in decades. He's shown little evidence over the years of having a personal stake in the abortion issue, and now he's reverting to form because the political winds have shifted. His abortion strategy for this election boils down to winking at moderate voters that he's returned to his pro-choice roots while employing demagogic language around late-term abortions to keep the pro-life voters in the camp. So in two destructive ways, Trump has acted as a cultural arsonist regarding the right to life. First, his false, cruel, and callous rhetoric about such a personal issue has only deepened the emotional chasm between the opposing sides. And second, his utter failure to grasp and articulate the core moral and ethical arguments on either side has damaged our ability to reason with one another about a problem of great moral complexity. It's always and only about politics with Trump. It's about posturing and positioning. He's trying to have it both ways. Having awoken the pro-choice movement through his Supreme Court nominations and his boasts about overturning Roe v. Wade, he found it politically expedient for many months afterwards to suggest a compromise version of a national ban. He doesn't understand the issue, so he failed to grasp how fully his compromise proposals undercut the core arguments of both sides. So having lit the fire and fanned the flames, he's now running away from the issue and, quote, leaving it to the states. If he were the sort of pro-life Republican that I used to vote for, I'd say that leaving it to the states could almost be a defensible position. When I helped mobilize around this issue decades ago, my main political goal was to get Supreme Court justices nominated who would eventually overturn Roe. We weren't talking about national bans back then. Perhaps I was misled, and it's clear I'm rethinking many of my past positions, but I strongly believed at the time that Roe was a bad opinion and that it wrongly took power from the states. But the conversation has moved beyond the states. Both sides have now mobilized for battle over a national solution. And neither side believes Trump when he says he's not going to sign a national abortion ban. His track record suggests that he'll do whatever serves his political interests when that moment arrives. So he's de-emphasizing abortion on the one hand, yet he continues his vile rhetoric when he speaks to pro-lifers at rallies. And Trump's divisive political speech, combined with his lack of moral clarity, has led the nation inexorably toward an all-out political fight, a destructive conflict over a sensitive issue that we will not solve through political warfare. And I no longer want any part of that fight. I worked in the pro-life movement for years, and until 2018, I refused to vote for a pro-choice candidate under any circumstances. I still care deeply about lifting the value of human life in our culture, but the Trump years changed me. In many ways, they broke me, and I'm still reassembling myself. His presidency taught me the ultimate futility of trying to address the issue through power politics. Trump has emitted such a noxious cloud around the pro-life message that in the minds of many Americans, the, quote, sanctity of human life sounds like just another weapon in his arsenal, devoid of moral substance, designed only to punish the enemies of MAGA. But while my views on abortion politics have changed, I'd like to make a point that many of my pro-choice friends don't take seriously enough. For most of us who call ourselves pro-life, our motivation really has been always as simple as seeing the unborn child as a human being and trying to figure out what to do about that. I understand that seeing the unborn child as a human being can lead to complex discussions around fetal personhood, which impacts decisions regarding issues like in vitro fertilization or certain forms of birth control. That's one reason I started moving off of my hardline approach many years ago. But I can't completely reconfigure my basic wiring on this issue. I was 7 years old in 1973 when Roe v. Wade came into effect, and I was about 8 years old the first time I heard about it in 1974. I saw a political ad about abortion at my grandparents' house, so I asked my mom what it meant. And she told me, and I decided from then on that I was on the baby's side. But once I was old enough to think more deeply about it, I never considered it to be such a simple case. I felt that it came down to balancing the rights of a woman against the rights of an unborn child, and I've always found that troubling. On most issues, I default heavily to the side of liberty. I'm geared toward increasing freedom of conscience, not limiting it. As I continued to work out my position over the years, I began to recognize God as the one who holds all the rights in the universe. So I increasingly grounded my understanding of human rights in the biblical teaching that each of us is created in the image of God. So when I spoke with secular folks, I might start with the Declaration of Independence and argue that, according to our founders, we're each endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, such as the right to life. And when I spoke to Christians, I'd begin with Genesis 1 and argue that our rights spring directly from our role as God's image bearers on the earth. In each case, though, I taught, and I still believe, that the greatest protection for human beings against exploitation and abuse is to recognize, along with the Declaration of Independence and Genesis 1, that our basic human rights come from somewhere far beyond the reach of mere earthly rulers. Whether that creator is the God of the Bible or an abstract idea that we recognize as part of our shared civic religion, the message is the same. Human beings have intrinsic value, rights, and dignity simply by virtue of being human. And these rights transcend politics. They matter. And balancing those rights against competing rights requires wisdom and grace. So none of this is easy. Even at the height of my political involvement, I never took it lightly that my pro-life position impinged on the bodily autonomy rights of an entire group of people, a group that I didn't belong to. But I couldn't shake my conviction that the unborn child's right to life outweighed the other considerations. So I felt constrained by my conscience to vote for candidates who opposed abortion. I still believe the unborn child is a human being. I don't know how I could see it any other way. But I no longer believe in the wisdom of my old political approach to upholding the sanctity of life. On purely pragmatic grounds, the anti-abortion movement has lost the public argument for at least the next generation. Yet radically anti-Christian candidates like Donald Trump still exploit pro-life Christian voters to get themselves elected. But even if our politics were more favorable to abortion bans, I've changed my mind about the prudence and effectiveness of overly strict measures. By listening to the pro-choice arguments, I've learned more about the negative impact strict abortion laws can have on women's health care, for instance. The legal and medical issues are complex. I've had to adopt a posture of greater humility as I rethink how my basic belief in the sanctity of life, which I still hold, ought to impact my political choices. And I don't have the answers. Once this election is over, I look forward to having the time to develop a more helpful approach to fostering a culture of life in our nation. For example, I listened to a Holy Post podcast a while back, an interview with Angela Wesley from the organization Prochoice. I was intrigued, and I planned to look more deeply into that organization. On their website, they identify themselves like this: "We are a community advancing a non-political approach to abortion that rises above the divide by demonstrating God's grace and value for all people." That seems like a good place to start. But Trump's rhetoric and the amoral political lens that he applies to the issue has made it more difficult for people to have the sorts of conversations that we ought to have. And by throwing in with a man as odious and transactional as Trump, pro-lifers have sacrificed whatever goodwill they may have built up in the culture. Trump has made it harder to simply talk non-politically about how we can elevate respect for human life at every stage. As someone who spent years speaking about the sanctity of life, I'm appalled by the way Trump exploits the issue. Here he is in the National Religious Broadcaster speech that I mentioned in an earlier chapter.
They're willing to kill the unborn in the 6th and 7th and 8th and 9th months, and even after birth. I mean, even after birth. You remember the governor, that former governor of Virginia, that said the baby will be born and we will decide to kill the baby after birth. We will make a decision with the mother. This is the first time I heard that, but there is legislation in some states where you actually have the right to do that. So they're the radicals.
In no state is it legal to kill the baby after birth. That's called murder everywhere in America. But Trump repeats this lie again and again because he knows that it packs a powerful emotional punch. And he knows that Americans broadly oppose abortion in the later months of pregnancy, after fetal viability. So he feels safe on that rhetorical ground. But the first time I heard Trump talk about late-term abortions, as he calls them, to a rally audience, I felt deeply troubled. I felt troubled by the obvious delight that he took in holding the crowd mesmerized with phrases like, quote, ripping the baby from its mother's womb. When I spoke on pro-life issues years ago, I found talking about the procedure itself quite difficult and sobering. But Trump seems energized by the language, by the vividness of the descriptions, by the power the imagery gives him over his audience. As I've mentioned, the dirty secret is that Trump focuses on abortions later in pregnancy because before he completely gave up and punted the issue to the states, he'd been pushing for a national compromise. And when he floated trial balloon suggestions for a national abortion ban, he talked about setting the allowed gestational age for abortions at either 15 or 16 weeks. This comment was typical. The number of weeks now people are agreeing on 15, and I'm thinking in terms of that. It'll come out to something that's very reasonable. But people are really, even hardliners are agreeing, seems to be 15 weeks, seems to be a number that people are agreeing at. Whether he realizes it or not, this position, which he falsely claims even hardliners agree to, is not very different from life under Roe v. Wade. Roe already allowed for government regulation of abortion after the point of fetal viability, which people often place between 20 and 24 weeks. It's been a while since I worked in the pro-life movement, but we used to have a phrase to describe the type of position Trump advocates. We called it pro-choice. Many Christians have called me a baby killer because I oppose Donald Trump. If they continue to embrace him this year, now that he's adopted a pro-choice stance, I'll just have to ask, was your support for Trump ever really about the babies? Donald Trump's national ban compromise would have only affected abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. And according to the Centers for Disease Control, over 96% of abortions occur before the end of the 15th week. So under the various compromises he suggested, over 96% of all abortions would be untouched by his proposed national ban. And a number of the 4% of abortions that might be banned under his compromise would fall under various exceptions, since they sometimes involve heartbreaking health circumstances. So this is where the demagogy comes into play. Trump's proposed compromise would affect only a small fraction of abortions, smaller than 4%, since many states already have laws against these procedures. So since he's in favor of choice, for all but a tiny fraction of abortions, he uses extreme language to assure his followers that he's really, really opposed to that tiny fraction. According to his rhetoric, that fractional difference between his own position and his opponent's position makes him a righteous defender of life, and his opponent some of the most radically evil human beings on the planet. Mike Pence spoke out forcefully against Trump's abortion stance on July 9th of this year. The Republican National Committee adopted new wording for the party platform to reflect Trump's retreat from abortion as an issue in the upcoming election. Pence said the new platform, quote, removed historic pro-life principles that have long been the foundation of the platform, unquote. According to CNN, Pence called on delegates attending the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, quote, to restore language to our party's platform, recognizing the sanctity of human life and affirming that the unborn child has a fundamental right to life which cannot be infringed, unquote. A vote for Donald Trump will mean less than nothing for the pro-life movement in 2024. It will ratify Trump's current position that abortion ought to be left completely to the states, and it will generally affirm his pro-choice understanding of where the lines ought to be drawn. So having appointed the justices who overturned Roe, he wants nothing more to do with the issue. He wants pro-life voters to support him in gratitude for what he did in the past, and he wants pro-choice voters to support him because they need not fear what he'll do in the future. Trump doesn't understand a person like Mike Pence, who seems to sincerely believe what he says about abortion. Pence has no choice but to oppose Trump's reasoning. It obliterates the very heart of the pro-life argument that life begins at conception. By so callously throwing out a certain number of weeks as though he's negotiating on the completion date for a new swimming pool at Mar-a-Lago, Trump thoroughly undermines the essence of the pro-life argument. As I've said, I came to see in the wake of the 2016 election that abortion politics has poisoned our nation against itself. I voted third party in 2016 rather than for Hillary Clinton, the pro-choice candidate. But by 2018 midterms, I saw how things worked, and I wish I had seen it sooner. Donald Trump and the GOP hacked the system somewhere along the way. They thought, with good reason, that people like me would never vote for a pro-choice candidate, so they took our votes for granted. They locked us tightly into their fold with this one issue. That meant they could expand their messaging out to an entirely new group of voters, and that new group of voters responded to a different kind of rhetoric, a kind that people like me find revolting and destructive, the rhetoric of anger and grievance and cultural paranoia. Donald Trump shows us every day by his demagogic language toward entire groups of people that his claim to be pro-life means nothing. It's a crass political attempt to purchase the votes of millions of people who, by any moral or ethical standard, ought to have rejected him long ago. Trump's language around abortion has nothing to do with the sanctity of life or an understanding of the image of God in every human being. He tramples on the image of God in his enemies every day. Christian support for Donald Trump under the guise of pro-life issues will be remembered in the years to come as a loathsome chapter in the history of the church. All right, so we got through that. Now, if you find this video helpful, please share it with someone. And if you buy the book, please leave a review on Amazon. And as always, thank you very much for listening.